In the heart of the Ironmoor Pack's territory, where ancient pines grow so tall they swallow the moon, and where the wind carries the scent of old power and older secrets, there is a girl. She has no title, no bloodline that anyone will acknowledge. She wakes before dawn, kindles the fires in the great hall, carries water from the frozen well with hands that have long since forgotten what it feels like to be warm. Her name is Lyra, and tonight, on the night of the autumn feast, the most sacred gathering of all 7 packs, something is going to change. Something that cannot be undone. This is her story. The great hall had never been louder. Lyra moved along the outer wall like a shadow, careful to keep the tray of wine goblets level as she wove between the long oak tables. 7 packs had gathered tonight. Alpha lords and their mates, warriors and elders, all dressed in furs and dark leather. The air smelled of pine resin, roasted boar, and the sharp, wild musk of dominant wolves barely keeping their instincts leashed. She kept her gaze down. That was the first rule a servant learned in Ironmoor Keep. Never meet a wolf's eyes. Never invite the attention of someone who could end your life with a single decision and face no consequence for it. She had learned that rule early. She had the scars to prove she'd once forgotten it. Servant. A heavy hand caught her shoulder, spinning her. Wine sloshed dangerously close to the edge of the tray. Lord Gareth of the Ashfin Pack, a broad man with a red-streaked beard and small, mean eyes, looked down at her with the particular expression of someone who enjoyed having power over things smaller than himself. "You missed my goblet. Forgive me, my lord." She kept her voice flat, her eyes on the middle distance just past his ear. She filled his goblet without spilling a drop. Long practice. He didn't release her shoulder. "New girl," he said, though she had served in this hall for 4 years. She doubted he had ever truly looked at her before. "No, my lord." His thumb pressed harder. She felt the bruise forming even as he spoke. "You've got strange eyes. What pack were you born to?" "None, my lord. I was found." That was the story she had been given. Found at the edge of the territory. An orphan of no consequence. She had repeated it so many times it had become true, at least to her. A truth she wore like a second skin, covering whatever lay beneath. Lord Gareth's nostrils flared, some wolf instinct stirring behind his eyes. Then, fortunately, someone at his table called his name, and his attention broke. He released her and turned away without another word. Lyra exhaled slowly, moved on. She was halfway to the servants' corridor when the hall went quiet. Not the natural lull that sometimes fell between songs or toasts. This was something else. A sudden, collective stillness, like every wolf in the room had heard the same sound just below the range of human hearing. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even Lord Gareth's laughter died. Lyra slowed, looked up despite herself. At the far end of the hall, beneath the great wolf-head tapestry that had hung there since the founding of the pack, stood the Alpha King, Kalian Dusk. She had seen him before, the way servants see their masters, in passing, at distance, always with the careful blankness of someone who knows that being noticed is dangerous. He was tall, in the way that mountains are tall, not just height but presence, the sense that the space around him was somehow rearranged by his existence. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and old authority. His eyes, even from across the hall, were the deep amber of a wolf just before it shifts, gold and brown and utterly predatory. He was speaking with Lord Aldrich of the Stone Peak Pack, his expression unreadable as always. The quiet in the hall lasted only a moment. Wolves recovered quickly. The social performance reasserted itself, but Lyra had stopped moving. She made herself start again. Tray, corridor, refill, disappear. She turned and walked directly into Elder Marin. The tray clattered. 2 goblets hit the stone floor with a sound like small bells. Wine spread across the ancient flagstones like a dark wound. Lyra dropped to her knees immediately, reaching for the goblets, already forming the apology that would hopefully be enough to avoid punishment, and froze. Elder Marin had not moved. She was very old, older than anyone in the hall, possibly older than anyone still living in all 7 pack territories. She was small and hunched, wrapped in gray wool despite the heat of the fires. With a face so deeply lined, it looked like a topographic map of some ancient mountain range. Her eyes were filmed over with white, the eyes of someone who had been blind for decades. But those blind eyes were fixed on Lyra's face with an intensity that made Lyra's skin prickle. Elder, forgive me, I wasn't watching where Marin's hand shot out. Thin fingers, surprisingly strong, wrapped around Lyra's wrist. The old woman went very still. The hall, which had begun to murmur back to life around them, went quiet again. Servants did not interact with elders. Elders did not touch servants. The wrongness of the tableau was pulling attention like a lodestone. Lyra tried, gently, to pull back. Marin's grip didn't move. Your blood, the old woman whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the hall was so quiet now that it carried. Your blood is singing. I don't understand, Elder. Marin's blind gaze traveled slowly down to Lyra's wrist, where her fingers were pressed against Lyra's pulse point. The old woman's lips moved silently for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of vast, settling recognition. The look of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a thing and has finally seen it arrive. She released Lyra's wrist, and then, with a slowness that made every person in the room hold their breath, Elder Marin, who had not bowed to anyone in living memory, who had not bent her knee even to the Alpha King himself, who carried the absolute authority of a seer recognized by all 7 packs, sank to her knees on the wine-stained floor. She bowed her head. The silence was total. Lyra stared at the top of the old woman's head. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear nothing else. What are you doing? She whispered. Elder, please, get up, you'll hurt yourself. I cannot stand before you, Marin said, her voice carrying that eerie clarity of the very old or the prophetic. Not anymore. Not now that I've touched your blood and felt what's in it. She raised her blind face. There were tears on it, tracking through the deep lines of her skin. I have waited 60 years for this night. Somewhere behind Lyra, a chair scraped back. Then another. Then a sound like a wave, the sound of dozens of people rising to their feet. Lyra turned slowly. The hall was standing. All of it, warriors and lords and servants alike, rising in ones and twos, and then all at once, pulled by some instinct older than thought, older than pack law. Faces she'd seen express nothing but contempt or indifference for 4 years were now turned toward her with expressions she couldn't read. And at the far end of the hall, amber eyes had found her face and hadn't moved. The Alpha King was not standing. He was already walking toward her. The crowd parted for him without him asking. It always did. That was the nature of an alpha's presence, the instinctual yielding of lower wolves, the automatic making way for the dominant one. Lyra had watched it happen 100 times. She had always been among the parting crowd. Now she was the fixed point that he was moving toward. She should move. Step aside. Drop her gaze. Every rule she had built her survival on was screaming at her to make herself small and invisible and unmemorable. Her feet didn't move. Kalion Dusk stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, he was somehow both exactly what she'd expected and nothing like it at all. The angles of his face were harder. The amber of his eyes was deeper. There was a scar that bisected his left brow, pale against his dark skin. A scar from a battle she had heard stories about since the day she arrived in the keep. A battle he had won. a battle that had ended the last war between the packs and cemented his authority over all 7 territories. He smelled like pine and winter rain and something older, something dark and smoky that curled at the base of her throat and made the hairs on her arms stand up. He was looking at her, really looking, the way she had always been careful not to be looked at. "Your name," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of someone who never needed to raise it. "Lyra." It came out steadier than she felt. "Lyra of, I have no pack name, my lord. I was found." Something moved behind his eyes. "Where?" "At the northeastern border. I was told. I don't remember it." She hesitated. "I was very young." His nostrils flared, almost imperceptible, but she was close enough to see it. His head tilted the slight degree that was the wolf equivalent of someone listening very hard. "How old are you?" he said. 23, my lord." Another fractional shift in his expression. Something tightening. 23, he repeated. It came out quiet, almost to himself. Alpha King. Elder Marin had risen, with help, and now stood at Lyra's side. The old woman's hand found Lyra's arm again, lighter this time. Not grasping, but steadying, the way you'd steady something precious. "I would speak with you, privately." "Tonight." "Yes," he said, and he was still looking at Lyra when he said it. "You will both come to my study, now." It wasn't a request. Lyra looked around the hall, at all the eyes still watching her, at Lord Gareth's reddened, unreadable face, at the other servants clustered near the kitchen passage, at the way no one was pretending not to stare anymore. Whatever invisible thing had held her ordinary life together had shattered tonight. She could feel the pieces of it around her feet like broken glass. She followed the Alpha King. The Alpha King's study was a room full of maps and the smell of old leather. A fire burned low in the grate. Bookshelves lined the walls floor to ceiling, and the desk was buried under correspondence, the perpetual administrative weight of governing 7 packs. He stood with his back to the room for a moment after they entered, the posture of someone gathering themselves. Then he turned and looked at Elder Marin. "Tell me what you know," he said. "All of it. What I know began 60 years ago, when I made a prophecy I did not fully understand." Marin settled into a chair, as though she had been expecting to sit in it for a very long time. Her blind eyes moved to Lyra, a daughter of the blood of the first pack. The blood that carried the original Alpha gift would be born in a time of fracture. She would be hidden. She would suffer, but she would be found. And when she was found, the 7 packs would be made whole. The silence stretched. "The first pack has been extinct for 600 years, the Alpha King said. "No," Marin said simply. "The bloodline went underground. Deliberately. To protect the last child from the regent." Kalion's expression hardened. "Aldrich. His family has hunted the bloodline for 3 generations. They were the ones who fractured the 7 packs in the first place, who needed them fractured, needed them weak, so that no alliance could ever gather enough strength to challenge the Stone Peak hold on the eastern territories." Marin's voice was steady as stone. The last heir was hidden as a newborn, left at the northeastern border of Ironmoor with a servant family. The servant family died in a fever 3 years later. The child survived. Her hand found Lyra's again. The child scrubbed floors. Lyra was very still. She had told herself, over the years, that she felt nothing about her unknown origins, that it didn't matter, that who you were was what you did, and not what blood ran in your veins. She had believed that, mostly. She didn't know what she believed right now. "There is a way to verify it," Marin continued. "The first pack bloodline carries a mark, a secondary mark, beneath the primary one. It only becomes visible when the blood is awakened." She looked at Lyra. "May I see your left shoulder?" Lyra's hand went to the collar of her servant's dress. She hesitated. She had a mark on her left shoulder. She had always had it. A faint silver line, almost like a scar, shaped like nothing she had ever been able to interpret. The keep's physician had looked at it once, years ago. and said it was a birthmark of no significance. She drew the collar of her dress aside. The fire popped. In the sudden quiet, she could hear the Alpha King cross the room. And then he stopped, very close. And she was acutely aware of his presence behind her shoulder, of his warmth, of the specific stillness of a man who has just seen something that has reordered his understanding of things. That, he said carefully, is the seal of the first Alpha. Yes, Marin said. Lyra turned her head and found him much closer than she'd expected, his face inches from her shoulder, his amber eyes now raised to meet hers. Something in his expression had shifted. Something had been dismantled and replaced by something else, something that looked like a man in the process of realizing that the world had been rearranged while he wasn't watching. It's real, he said quietly. He wasn't speaking to Marin. Yes, Lyra said, equally quiet. I think it might be. Marin had been escorted to her rooms by two of the Alpha King's most trusted guards. She had gone willingly, with the unhurried calm of someone who had delivered their news and was content to let the consequences unfold. That left Lyra alone with Kalian Dusk. She had pulled her collar back up. The mark was covered, but she was aware of it in a way she had never been before, aware of it like a brand, or a key, or both. He was standing at the window, looking out over the dark territory below. She stood near the fire, because she was always cold, and watched the line of his shoulders. You didn't know, he said, not a question. No. How long have you been in this keep? 4 years. Before that, the village of Durin at the edge of the eastern ridge. Before that, a family in Thornwall who took me in when I was 12, after the fever took the family I'd been placed with. She paused. I moved a lot. People were uncomfortable with me, even when they didn't know why. His jaw tightened. She could see it from across the room. Because your blood was singing, he said. The way Marin described. Other wolves can sense dominant bloodlines, even without being able to name what they're sensing. It makes them uneasy, aggressive, or dismissive, she said. Or cruel. Yes, the word carried something heavy in it. Or that. He turned from the window then, and the firelight carved strange golden shapes across his face. He was looking at her with that deep, unguarded attention that had started in the hall and hadn't stopped. Looking the way the wolf looks at the thing it has decided is important, with a focused gravity that made her want to look away and somehow couldn't. The Regent will know, he said. Whatever happened in that hall tonight, it will have already reached him. Aldrich has eyes everywhere. What does that mean for me? It means you are in danger. He said it directly, without softening. She appreciated that. She had had enough of people telling her comfortable lies. It also means you are under my protection, effective immediately. No one touches you without going through me. Something about the way he said it, the absolute, unqualified certainty of it, made her throat tighten in a way she didn't quite understand. You don't know me, she said. You can't. I know what your blood is. He was crossing the room now, slowly, deliberately, the way predators move when they're not hunting, but simply existing in their nature. He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that she could see the amber shifting in his eyes, that slight luminous variation that meant wolf thoughts running just below the surface. I know what the seer said about you. And I know. He stopped. His nostrils flared, barely. His voice, when he continued, was quieter. I know what I've been ignoring since the moment you walked into that hall with your tray and your careful eyes and your shoulders set like you were carrying something no one else could see. Lyra was very still. What does that mean? I don't know yet, he said, with what sounded like honesty that cost him something. But I intend to find out. She should say something careful, something practical. She should ask about shelter and safety, and the logistics of what came next. Instead, she said, I've been so tired. It came out small and true and surprising even to her. 4 years of keeping her shoulders set, of moving like a shadow, of learning not to want anything enough to hurt when she didn't get it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and his thumb pressed gently against the side of her wrist, exactly where Marin had held her. He found her pulse. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't have to be anymore." The fire crackled. Outside the study window, the territory slept under its dark sky, and Lyra, for the first time in 4 years, did not pull away. She slept, for the first time in years, without dreaming of running. He had given her a room, a proper room, with a fire and a lock and a bed that had more than one blanket. He had given her a guard outside the door without making a performance of it. He had given her, most remarkably, space. She woke 3 hours before dawn to the sound of the guard outside her door saying something sharp and low, and then a second voice she recognized. The smooth, precise tenor of Lord Aldrich's personal secretary. She was at the door before she was fully awake. Request that the servant girl be made available for questioning by Lord Aldrich in his capacity as— "She's not a servant," her guard said flatly. "And Lord Aldrich has no capacity here. Move along. The Regent has no authority in the Alpha King's private wing. Move." A pause. Then receding footsteps. Lyra pressed her back against the door and breathed. They were already moving. Of course they were. Aldrich had not maintained his family's power across 3 generations by being slow. She thought about what Marin had said. The bloodline that Aldrich had hunted. The heir who had been hidden as a newborn, because keeping her alive meant keeping her invisible. She had been invisible for 23 years. She thought about Kalion's thumb on her wrist, finding her pulse. She was done being invisible. She dressed in her servant's clothes, because they were what she had. She would need to fix that eventually. She walked to the Great Hall because that was where the confrontation was going to happen. She could feel it the way she'd always felt oncoming storms, that low electric pressure building in the air. She had spent 4 years reading this keep. She knew its rhythms. They were all there. Kalion, standing at the head of the long table, his expression locked into something careful and controlled. Lord Aldrich, seated across from him, robed in Stone Peak gray, with the face of a man who had decided how this conversation was going to go. Several of Aldrich's men positioned at the hall's edges, and arrayed behind Kalion, his own people, his warriors, his advisors. Elder Marin, having apparently decided that sleep was for people who didn't have prophecies to see through to completion. Lyra stopped in the doorway. Kalion's eyes found her immediately. Something in his expression shifted, just fractionally, in the way of someone who has been calculating outcomes and has had one variable arrive earlier than expected. Aldrich turned to look at what had caught the Alpha King's attention. His gaze landed on Lyra, and she watched him perform a quick and ruthless reassessment. Whatever expression he'd been wearing, polished political courtesy, solidified into something colder. "Ah," he said, "the servant girl. She has a name," Kalion said. "Indeed, though one wonders, does a name bestowed by the people who hid her change anything about what she actually is?" Aldrich's voice was mild, the verbal equivalent of a blade that looks like a letter opener. A child found at a border. No bloodline, no pack. A story that Elder Marin has, apparently, decided to complicate dramatically. "The mark on her shoulder," Marin began. "Could be anything," Aldrich said. "A birthmark, a scar. I've known the old woman a long time. She sees what she wants to see." Lyra walked into the hall. She wasn't sure why. The careful, invisible part of her was aghast. But something older than caution was moving her feet, and she was done. She was genuinely done with letting other people speak about her as though she weren't in the room. She stopped beside Kalion, not behind him. Beside. He glanced at her. A quick, assessing look. Then he looked back at Aldrich, and something in the line of his shoulders had changed. Some subtle loosening, as though a variable had resolved favorably. "Lord Aldrich," she said. Her voice was steady. She hadn't known it would be until it was. You sent someone to my door before dawn this morning. A simple inquiry. You sent someone to collect me before anyone else in the keep was awake, on the night your seer identified me in front of 7 packs worth of witnesses. She held his gaze. She had practiced holding the gaze of men who frightened her. She had a lot of practice. I know what that means. So does everyone in this hall. The silence was the kind that happens after something has been said that can't be unsaid. Aldrich's expression was unreadable, but his eyes, for just a moment, showed something. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man who has seen a board position he thought was one shift toward complicated. You are very bold, he said finally, for someone with no proof of anything. The mark is proof, Marin said. The mark can be verified, Kalion said. His voice had dropped into the register that meant the conversation was over, and what came next wasn't conversation. There are 3 other seers in the packed territories. I will send for all 3. They will come here, they will read the mark, and their verdict will be entered into the treaty record as binding. Aldrich was very still. That process takes months, he said. Then Lyra will be my guest for months. Kalion turned and looked at her, and something passed between them. A look that was also a question, and an answer, and something neither of them had words for yet. Under my full protection. The hall breathed. Aldrich rose. He straightened his robes. He inclined his head in a bow that was technically correct and entirely empty of submission. As the Alpha King wishes, he said. He left. His men filed out behind him. The door closed, and Lyra became aware that her hand had somehow found Kalion's arm, just her fingers against his forearm, steadying herself without having planned to. She started to pull back. His hand covered hers. Stayed it. Don't, he said quietly. She didn't. 3 weeks later, she stood on the battlements and watched the sun go down over the territories. She had new clothes. Nothing dramatic. She had specifically asked for nothing dramatic. Not yet. Not until the seers had spoken and the thing was settled and formal. But warm things. Good things. Things that fit. She had begun to learn the histories she hadn't been taught. The first pack. The fracture. The 3 generations of Aldrich's family, systematically dismantling the alliances that had held the 7 packs together. The child hidden at the border to protect a bloodline that could, if it were acknowledged and supported, rebuild what had been broken. She had begun to understand why Marin had cried. She heard him before she saw him. His footstep on the stairs, unhurried, familiar in a way she was still adjusting to. The way that certain presences become familiar quickly and completely, as though you have always been calibrated to their frequency and simply hadn't been in range before. Kalion came to stand beside her at the battlement wall. He looked out over the same view. For a moment neither of them said anything. They had been developing a comfortable vocabulary of useful silences, the 2 of them. Seer Lyra arrives tomorrow, he said. From the Northern Territory. I know. She's the most respected of the 3. If she reads the mark the same way Marin did. I know, she said again. She meant, I know what it means. I know the shape of the future that's opening up, how large and strange and terrifying it is. I know that I don't have the first idea how to be what that future requires. He turned to look at her. You've been quiet, he said. I've been thinking. About? She looked up at him. The amber of his eyes in the fading light had shifted towards something softer and more complex, and she had stopped being afraid of that, of being really seen by him, of the specific attention he gave her that was unlike the attention anyone had ever paid her before. About the fact that I've spent 23 years being careful not to want things, she said, and I'm trying to figure out what I actually want, now that I'm allowed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and I'm still figuring it out. She held his gaze. But I think I want to stay. His expression did the thing she had learned to read in the weeks of being close to him. That fractional softening, the slight dropping of the careful governance he kept over his own face, revealing something warmer and more unguarded beneath. He reached out, slow and deliberate as he always was when he touched her, as though she were something that deserved to be approached with care. His hand curved against her jaw, tilting her face up. "Then stay," he said, and then he kissed her. It was not the desperate, consuming thing she might have imagined once in some younger, more frightened version of herself. It was quiet, sure, the kiss of a man who has made a decision and intends to keep it, his mouth warm against hers, his thumb brushing the line of her cheekbone, the cold wind off the territory moving around them and neither of them noticing. When he lifted his head, his amber eyes were very close, very soft. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "since the moment you stood beside me instead of behind me." She felt the smile before she could stop it. "Only since then. Perhaps a little before," he admitted. The last of the sunlight moved over the territory below, over the dark forest and the distant pack villages and the old land that had been fractured for too long. Lyra looked at it and felt, for the first time in her memory, like she was looking at something that might be hers. She had been a servant girl. She had been a shadow, a nobody, a found child with no name worth keeping. She had been hidden. Not anymore.